Well, I think we'll go ahead and start.
Sure.
If it's okay with you.
Yeah.
So I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Leung. Is that how you pronounce your last name? And to tell you the truth, this is the first time we met, but I really wanted to find a researcher in this area of the user experience and interfaces, and I was searching all around, and his name kept coming up, so I just hunted him down and said, please come, please come. And he got his PhD, Dr. Leung, from University of British Columbia in 2011. So you have been out of academia for just 4 or 5 years now. And his area is the user experience. So he's conducted research since that time for a variety of companies and is now part of a startup company, right, that's doing this.
It used to be,
right?
But yeah, another multinational.
Well,
yeah,
yeah. And has been working with a number of academic industry partnerships and to explore research findings and ideas from academia that can translate into products and tools. I also, just so that the computer science and engineers know that he doesn't just look at the interface side, which is important. I actually looked at your LinkedIn page and I saw some of your earlier work, like you did some web design to configure computer systems for the university community. And I like this one, you evaluated vibration isolating equipment developed by the Canadian Space Agency for conducting experiments in space. So you've done everything from hardware to software to user experience, and today you're going to come and talk about making technology accessible for older adults. So thank you again for coming to visit us.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Let me just start with a quote from Douglas Adams, author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So everything that's already in the world when you're born is just normal. Anything that gets invented between then and before you turn 30 is incredibly exciting and creative, and with any luck, you can make a career out of it. Anything that gets invented after you're 30 is against the natural order of things and the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it, until it's been around for about 10 years when it gradually turns out to be all right, really. So he touches on, an interesting challenge and thing that we are thinking about a lot in this area of germ technology. It's very nice to meet you. I'm very happy and honored to be invited to be part of this speaker series, especially given just the prominent speakers that have been in the series already. But it's actually really a double pleasure just to talk to people who have an interest in germ technology, in supporting older adults and through the innovative use of technology. I was briefly reading through the germ technology course and was really excited to see that part of the component there was to actually meet with some older adults and do a project there. And I wish I had something like that when I was going through my graduate program. So it's an interesting time in this research field. You have a lot of really interesting technologies being created, smart homes, which you got a preview of today, robots, intelligent prompting, even apps. There's a lot of really interesting and potentially beneficial technologies out there. But the question is, what if older adults have difficulty learning to use them? There's evidence that older adults have more difficulty picking up new technologies, like using the internet, even mobile devices. If that's the case for the technology you're developing, what can we do? And so that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. This is the research that I did for my PhD research at the University of British Columbia with Dr. Joanna McGrenery from computer science and Dr. Peter Graff from psychology. So it's great as it's multidisciplinary approach, which seems to be shared here, and a number of my co-authors. And I want to acknowledge the funding and tech support that I had. What we looked at in that overall question of what can we do to help make technology easier for older adults, we focused on mobile devices and how we might improve the learnability of it. So learnability, that's like the initial usability. It's the support for helping the user to perform tasks initially when they use the new product. For mobile devices, I'm talking about not scooters and walkers, which somebody who was in the field was referring mobile devices to. I'm talking about mobile computing devices. So these are video players, digital cameras, smartphones, PDAs, electronic organizers. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is what I mean by design, characteristics of the user that are relevant to learning to use the technology, and some design approaches that we looked at. And some takeaways. I hope that in the end that you will find some interesting insights into older adults that might be relevant for your project, or some ideas about making technology easier to use. And so I'm definitely open to any questions as we go along, especially clarifications, and there'll be time at the end to have more thorough discussion. Okay, so let's talk about design. And bear with me if this is already familiar topic to you. So the scope of design I'm talking about is human-computer interaction research, and also in designing user interfaces and influencing the user's user experience. So you know, those terms are very related, and one way that I like to think about it in terms of the difference there is, so imagine you're eating cereal. The user interface is the bowl and the spoon. Maybe you're consuming some product. And the overall eating of it is the user experience. And human-computer interaction touches actually on a lot of these different topics. And as you likely know, it's not just about aesthetics. Steve Jobs was quoted as saying, "Most people make the mistake of thinking that design is what it looks like. People think that it's the veneer, that designers are handed this box and told, make it look good. That's not what we think design is. It's not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works." And design is an established process. There's a lot of variations on this, but this is one way of looking at it. You start with user research. You go and you get an understanding of the user and who you're designing for. You come up with some designs. Oftentimes it's brainstorming, coming up with lots of alternatives, refining, selecting one that you would actually like to go ahead with. You build that out into some kind of prototype. And then you go back to the user and you evaluate it. How closely does this meet their needs? What are some pain points? And then you go back to design and it iterates. One useful concept in human-computer interaction is the concept of mental model, which helps us to understand this relationship between design and a user being able to learn to use the system. So you have the designer of the system, and they have a mental model. So mental model, it's like their understanding of the way the system works. Because they're designing it, they have an accurate and comprehensive understanding of the system, and so they build out the system. The user's mental model is a lot more dynamic, and it shifts, and it is not always accurate. It's not always comprehensive, and it's formed by their interactions with the system. So maybe the visual controls, the affordances there. Maybe it's the feedback that they get from interacting with it. That all informs what they understand of the system. But it's also informed by their expectations of the system, their needs, their pre-existing behaviors, their experiences with similar or different systems. And so the designer can only communicate the mental model through the system. They can't talk directly to the user. And so it's really up to the designer to create something that helps the user form a useful mental model to operate that system. But there are some things that the designer can't control, which is the user's needs, behaviors, and experiences. And so that's why it's really important for the designer to understand the user. So let's talk about a more concrete example. Faucets, washing your hands. So what's the task there? You want to wash your hands, get the water conveniently. You don't want it to scald you. You don't want it to be cold. You want to be able to easily get in and out and accomplish the task of washing your hands. So I'll open up to you. Which would you prefer? So you have, now these are existing faucets. The one on the left or the right? Okay, why? Okay, yeah, and what does that allow you to do?
You need to predict the temperature you want without having to go back and adjust it to the
Right.
Get to the perfect point.
What's the problem with the one on the right? So if the case is not clear, so one is like a hot tap and one's a cold tap. What's the problem there? Yeah, yeah.
So there's two final products and neither of them are probably what you have.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Right. You have to go back and forth. Oh, sorry.
The water is not really
Right. Okay. So you're either getting a cold or a hot one. You're not getting one this.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
There is no indication of which side is which also.
Yeah. Right. That's right. So yeah, it's not clear. So you'll have to test it out. The other question: why do you think this was the one on the left was designed the way it was? Yeah, you know, right? Any guesses?
probably easier for the designer.
Yeah. Why? Yeah. Why so?
Because they just ended up with the hot pipe or the cold pipe and just have the same faucet twice, basically.
Right, yeah. So the designer relied on the underlying system, right? If you're into plumbing, you know that water comes in on a hot pipe and a cold pipe, and the designer just mapped the interface straight to there. And that's a problem in this case.
There's another one, the valve for the right one is more complex than the valve on the left one to be able to choose between the two sources. And so they may not even have that technology depending on what was available.
You would think that, but this is actually used currently in the UK.
Yes.
Yeah.
Habits.
Yeah, maybe. So so that's right. So this is based on sort of the underlying system, whereas this is more mapped to the user's needs for flow and for temperature. And so not to criticize the designers, because really in my experience this happens a lot where the design is built right onto the underlying system and less according to the user's needs. And a faucet is just a simple example. You can have many different ways of designing a faucet, and for specific users, specific needs. And so the key that I want to, the main point that I want to drive here is it's really important to focus on the user and to tailor your interface to them. So let's go and talk about users. So older adults, and I define them as adults 65 and older, although people operationalize that a little bit differently, but that's the age that I'm using. But really, although age is useful in some ways, the older adult community, as you know, is a very heterogeneous community. They differ in experiences, backgrounds, cognitive, physical abilities. And so really, when you're talking about them, it's really important to be able to understand sort of, that first that the group is different, but be able to identify sort of when you're talking about them, who are you really talking about. But as a whole, older adults are remaining active and living longer, which is great. And they are benefiting from technology, both ones that are designed for the general public and ones that are designing for them. But as I mentioned, that older adults, especially, at least for the area that I looked at, which is mobile devices, there's a lot of evidence that shows that older adults have difficulties using mobile devices like smartphones. I remember a participant who came to one of our studies. I'll call her Mary, but that's not her actual name. She was 67, retired, living on her own, had some college education, used a computer and could actually do quite a lot there, was interested in using a smartphone, but was quite apprehensive about the learning process. So the older adults, some of them have difficulties using mobile devices. So the question is why? What are some factors behind that? I'm just going to play you a short clip here of a comedy sketch. This is a satire, but I think it colorfully illustrates some issues that older people have with learning technology. Okay, I'm going to pause it there, but if you are interested in that, I'll include the link on the video. But eventually the mom is able to download her podcast, is very proud of herself. The son starts up smoking again, and the dad calls later on to ask for help to reset the clock on his VCR. So, okay, so what are some things that we heard there? So possible factors that might make it difficult for older adults to learn are just declines in cognitive abilities. So research has shown that older adults have natural declines in working memory, which is really important for learning and for processing speed. The other aspect is past UI experiences, so experiences with previous generation user interfaces. So now we have software user interfaces. In the past, we had mechanical, electrical ones. One key difference there is that past user interfaces, you had one control and it would do one thing, whereas now we have one control depending on what context you have, whether it's a button, either physical or software or visual. You might do different things depending on what context it's in. Research has also shown that older adults have that they feel a more negative impact of errors, that it's harder for them to recover and to continue on to their task, which makes it difficult to learn. And there's also an influence of technology that, take your smartphone with the same form factor, just getting increasingly powerful, more complex, and controls are hidden. All those make it difficult for older adults to learn. We are also interested in how older adults actually go about learning and whether they might seek this help differently. And so there wasn't definitive prior research done. There was some mixed findings, so we decided to run a survey study. What we were interested was in how older adults go about learning to use mobile devices, what resources they used, what they found useful, what they found wasn't useful, and how that informed how they went about learning to use mobile devices. One key finding that we had was there was a difference between what they wanted to learn. Older adults want to learn procedures over concepts. So in our survey, we asked how important is it to figure out the exact steps required for performing a task? And how important is it for you to gain a general understanding of the way software works? And we found that there was a significant age difference in the responses. Older adults felt it was very important to learn to perform the exact steps, and less so gaining a general understanding of the way that works. Whereas for younger people, for the younger population, it was about the same. There was also a difference in preference. There was a lot of research that showed that the general public will try things using trial and error, or will go and seek for help from somebody. But we found that at least our older respondents preferred to learn individually, which was surprising to us. The manual was also a place that they would go to for help. They would like demonstrations of how a task was performed, and then opportunities to practice. Any questions about this so far before I move on? Okay, yes.
Do you have any idea why they preferred procedures over concepts?
We have, our thoughts on that are that two things. One is there's a lot of variety in mobile devices, and so if you're not going to well, that there's just less prior knowledge to sort of draw from, and it makes less sense in somebody's mind that, well, everything is different, so I'm just going to learn how to perform these exact tasks, and maybe for older adults, or at least definitely for novice users, that they might not use a lot of tasks and just want to perform just a number of key tasks. And so they might just need to, get up and going and not need to just develop a more comprehensive mental model the way it works. And secondly, it might also be related to how long you might want to use that knowledge for. So at least when we were talking to a lot of our participants, we got the sense that they would want to learn to use something like a mobile device, smartphone, and that they might not use it very frequently and not use it for very long. And so the trade-off for spending all that time learning to use it was not offset by that benefit.
Yeah, I think those both make a lot of sense. Did you have enough people to look at any individual differences, like older adults who weren't novices, and see if that changed anything?
Yeah. Can't remember if there's statistically significant differences there, but we did see a trend of those who were novices who just had very little experience compared to those who had some experience, that they would want to learn to use the steps, learn the steps.
Is it possible that the differences could also be due to generational differences? Because they come from a very different time with a different environment, how they were raised as adolescents and young adults, and work experiences and learning is probably much different than how we do it now. Is that possible?
I think, yeah, generational differences, especially in terms of their experience with previous technologies. I think there's also, on that point, it's people's relationships with computers. If you think of how you go about learning to use a phone, you'll try things out, and if it, you probably aren't worried too much that it's going to break the device. Whereas a lot of older people, they grew up in the time where computers were a lot more fragile. They're big. You really had to worry about static discharge, and that could actually damage the computer. And so I think that those experiences add to it as well. I'm not sure about. I'm not able to comment on sort of differences between learning styles. Whether trial and error is just something more associated with this generation than older adults, but that's definitely something interesting to look into. Yeah.
I have two questions. First one is about you said older adults prefer to use the manual, and in fact, some papers they do some surveys about how those technology terms be familiar with older adults. If they were very prefer to using manual, but there are so many technology terms they are not quite familiar with, then how can they really understand what the manual really teach about?
Yeah, that's a really good insight that I didn't get into, which is a lot of older adults, just in general, our respondents preferred using the manual, but those who didn't identified some of those challenges with the terminology, that it might not have enough detail, that actually makes it more difficult to use the manual.
Yeah, and I have another question. Since you list those, there were 4 preferences here, then do you think if there's some tutorial system for older adults and then they combine all these features, will that be a guarantee to have older adults have a very good learning result from it, or maybe it's not guaranteed?
That's a good question. I'll ask you to hold that thought because we'll adjust that in one of the design approaches. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, of these parameters, how many of them are differences between older adults and younger adults, and how many of them would be true for anybody that is unfamiliar with the device?
Really good question. Yeah. Yeah, we did look at that. So, and I'll touch on this a little bit, but when we recruited our participants, we made sure to recruit both older and younger adults, so to be able to identify differences between the age groups. Learning individually was something common across across all the age groups, but the manual was different. Older adults preferred using the manual, whereas younger adults preferred trial and error. Vast majority of them preferred trial and error and searching on the internet. Demonstrations, opportunities for practice. I can't remember whether there was any statistically significant differences, but I know, yeah, definitely for manual and trial and error.
As far as differences in preference, learning step by step versus learning the overall sort of concept, are there also then differences in what actually works for these two groups? Like, does step by step actually work for older adults who maybe have the capacity to learn the overall general?
That's a good question. Yeah, we hadn't looked into sort of the effectiveness of each of them, but off the top of my head, I would think that the step-by-step would allow them to do those tasks that they've learned, so it would be good for initial learning, but learning gaining the general understanding is better for long-term use. Yeah. Okay. Let me move on to the design approaches that we looked at. So some were based on, some were heavily researched, and so I'll briefly go through those. And there were some approaches that hadn't had much investigation, so we've done a study on that, and I'll touch on those. So some approaches that are out there, and there's likely more. One is improving the design of user interface elements, permanently reducing the functionality, and incorporating scaffolding. So one area is to look at your user interface and try to make it easier for an older adult. So a lot of accessibility work has been done there, improving font size, or looking at font size, colors, contrast, things like that. There's a lot of other work that can be done on looking at, for example, improving buttons, gestures, the keyboard, for example. There hadn't been a lot of work on icons, usability of icons for older adults, so we ran a study to explore that. So here's an icon, and you have various parts to it. You have a graphical object, sometimes a label, and it's situated in context of an application and a device. And it has a particular meaning. So for example, this one is, if you click on this, you'll go to the application for viewing and managing contact information. So there was a lot of work done on size of icon and on the usability there. We didn't look at that. We looked at more other aspects like label, the influence of presence and absence of a label, concreteness, and we define that as how closely does this graphical object look like something that's out in the real world. And there's semantic distance. How close is what's being shown here to what it actually means? And so this is quite subjective, but it is a really important part of an icon. And I'll give you another example of some icons of different concreteness and semantic distance. And so these are all pulled from existing mobile devices. So we have web here, and so this looks like a compass. So it's concretely close. Sorry, it's a concrete icon, but it's a compass and web. It's quite far. Something that's more. Let's go to this one. It looks like a phone, but this is and it's close to what the function is of that icon. You can have more abstract icons. So this is for settings, and many think it's semantically far. Or you can have tasks, and this looks like a abstracted to-do list, and it's close to what its function is. So again, I mentioned that in all our studies, we recruited older adults, and we focused on those without serious physical or cognitive impairments. And we also recruited younger participants to help us identify age-related effects. We ran an experiment. We had 36 participants. We we presented them with 60 icons from existing mobile devices, and we asked them for each icon to identify the object in that icon, to interpret the function, and to rate the confidence and familiarity, because that could be an influence there which we controlled for. So here are the findings. This is really a very high-level view of them, and if you want more details, I'll refer you to the papers that are available on my website. So we were wondering whether the usability of icons was more difficult for older adults, and we found that it was, that they were more difficult for older adults to interpret, which might be a factor into why it makes it difficult to learn to use mobile devices. We found that labels helped both younger and older adults to interpret the icons. Concreteness, we thought it would have an influence, but it had actually little impact on icon interpretability. But what made a difference was the semantic closeness, that semantic close icons were easier for older adults to interpret. So I'll move on to another design approach. This one is about reducing the functionality, permanently reducing the functionality. So for mobile devices, these are products that have been made that have been designed and targeted for older adults. So you can call. They've taken away a lot of the other functionality. Here's a tablet communication device that actually is out of a startup in Vancouver, and here they use it. It's placed in the home, and it allows them to communicate with their caregivers. So here again, they've taken a standard Android tablet and they've stripped away a lot of the extra functionality. So this is more of an understood approach, so we didn't look into this one. Another aspect, another design approach that can be taken is to incorporate scaffolding. And so, like the scaffolds used to build a home, these are temporary support structures that are used as something is built up, and then once the home is built up, the scaffolds come down. So similarly, there's scaffolding that can be done to help to help any user to learn something. And so I'll show you 4 examples. So one aspect that has had a lot of prior research is classroom learning, training. And so there's, and this was, done quite a number of years ago, so it was focused on desktop applications. But a lot of design recommendations have come out of this. Second one is using a manual, and we talked about how, there's a preference for using it, but there are some drawbacks, as has been mentioned, for using the manual. And there's also the interesting bit of our devices generally don't come with manuals now, that mainly have just quick start cards. And so it relies a lot on, the current devices rely a lot on just the interface for teaching people how to use it. But this is an area that could provide additional guidance. So given the drawbacks of the manual, we looked at how you might be able to produce something, learning resource that's more interactive, that provides more real-time guidance. And so we looked at this opportunity of using a mobile device paired with another screen. Mobile device has a very limited screen real estate, so there's not a lot you can show, and you often need to hide it, which taxes your visual spatial memory system. But what if you could provide more guidance on an additional display while the learning process? How much can that help you? So we relied on the survey findings to produce, to figure out what we could put on this additional display that might help. So I'll show you a quick demo of what we came up with.
Help Kiosk augments a smartphone's small display with a larger one to provide guidance and feedback. Here's a demo of how Help Kiosk is used. Let's say you want to add a contact on your new phone but aren't sure how to. Using Help Kiosk, you use the Find Info pane to find the desired instructions. You can then use the text instructions to figure out the task steps. If the text doesn't help for a particular step, Help Kiosk suggests more help and can be accessed by pressing on the step text. The Live View pane suggests the UI elements that the user should interact with. The Demo pane shows someone performing the step on a similar device and also shows the expected result. You can also get more help on various sub-steps.
Yeah, so some of the design considerations that we put into Help Kiosk, we looked at the principles behind designing a manual, and they were aspects like don't overwhelm the user, use familiar terminology, this procedural learning. We also incorporated, as mentioned in the video, just various ways of getting that information. So you have the steps here, set as succinctly as possible. We have this live view, which is like a screen share of what's shown on the device. And you'll see the steps and the user interface elements that are required for performing the steps highlighted on the device so that the user knows where to press. And there's also a demonstration video here where you click on it and then you can see how to perform that task, but also also the end result of performing that task, which is something that is not often shown in a manual. So this is something that we did. We ran an informal study, and it looked like older adults did prefer using this to learn sort of common tasks versus the manual that came with this Google Nexus 1, which was actually a pretty comprehensive manual. A fourth example is a multi-layered interface. So the first three design approaches that I talked about were learning resources outside the device, external to the device. But there's this design approach example actually talks about how you might redesign the interface to provide some scaffolding. So you might be familiar with applications where you might have like a basic and advanced setting, or like a basic and professional. And really what we're talking about there is a reduced functionality interface, which has some of the features, and then you have another layer that has more functions, and you can go between the different layers. So we were interested in knowing how much this helps older adults learn. Our hypothesis that learning on a reduced functionality interface would allow them to learn to perform tasks easier, to be able to retain them, and be able to help them to learn to use more advanced tasks, to perform advanced tasks. So we researched this through the use of a mobile address book on the device, on a smartphone. And so here you have the reduced functionality one, call, view, new contact, and there was a second page that you could go to. And the full functionality interface had more features. We ran an experiment with both older and younger adults. And we had two task sets, some that were basic, that could be performed on the reduced functionality interface, and then advanced one that could only be done on the full functionality interface. With 4 phases. Acquire the basic tasks, take a break, perform them again to see how well you've retained them, and then perform the basic tasks on the full functionality interface, and then perform advanced tasks. So this is going to get complex, but I'm just going to keep it at the high level. So for the multi-layered group, they started learning on the reduced functionality interface, and then switched over to a full functionality interface later, whereas the control condition just learned everything on the full functionality interface. So what did we find? We did find that this that learning on a multi-layered interface can help older adults. They learn to perform basic tasks in less time, in about half the time in the initial attempt, and in fewer extra steps than the controlled group. And that they were able to better retain the mastery of that task after that break. And we didn't see this with the younger adults. Interestingly to us, learning to perform the task on the reduced functionality interface didn't help nor hinder them from learning to perform advanced tasks on the full functionality interface. And perhaps that has something to do with this procedural learning, this focus on learning exact steps as opposed to better understanding sort of how the different, how the user interface is designed and how things work together. But older adults preferred the multi-layered interface for learning, and the nuance there is that they preferred it for learning for initial use. But some older adults complained that switching from the reduced functionality interface to the full functionality interface added some complexity, and that if they were to use the advanced features, that they would actually just want to learn it all at the same time and not start with the reduced functionality interface. So we've gone over some design approaches, and I wanted to take a step back and just talk about, briefly, what did we learn from our research? So one is the importance of supporting procedural learning to help older adults perform tasks by helping them to perform steps. That was more important than helping them to understand the overall the way that the system was designed and how it worked. And across our different research projects, we found that close semantic distance is important, whether it's for icons or whether it's for terminology in the manual to what older adults were expecting. We want to try to reduce that semantic distance. And we also found that it was really important for older adults to have a positive experience during initial attempts. Remember, going back to the participant Mary, so we had her in the study where we analyzed the Help Kiosk, and we asked her to perform a number of tasks with the help of Help Kiosk. And initially she went in, even though she was interested in mobile devices, she was quite apprehensive and wasn't quite sure if she could learn. But we found that with some positive experience in the first initial steps, that she was able to perform tasks, you could get the sense that she was getting more confident using the mobile device. And she even expressed at the end of the study, hey, I think I can do this, and I think I'm encouraged by this experience. And so, reflecting on this and other stories that we saw in our research, I'm encouraged myself that careful design of a user interface of a system can help older adults to learn to use mobile technology and other technologies as well. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Have you seen differences yet, just as far as just looking at 65 plus, but those closer to 65 versus those even older? And do you expect that that'll continue as technology becomes more ubiquitous?
Yeah, we didn't look at sort of differences within an age group, but yeah, in a lot of ways, I expect that there will be differences. 65 is, in some ways, it's a useful, but a little bit, it's a useful divider, but really, it can be adjusted. But yeah, I think that there will be differences. Like I mentioned, the group is quite heterogeneous, so there will be differences in cognitive abilities, but influences of whether you're still working or not, your work experiences, the support that you have can differ quite a bit depending on how old you are and your circumstance.
Do you use any software like Moray or anything like that for your usability
We didn't for our research, but yeah, I've used it before, and it's very useful. Yeah.
So this group are working on a number of apps for use for older adults. Do you have some takeaways in terms of designing it from the beginning, and as well suggestions for how to involve older adults in the design and testing of the cycle impact?
Mm-hmm.
Practical approaches for those two.
Yes, so very important to talk to older adults, to your target users. Some, going further or more specific into that, I think, presenting a number of different designs, getting feedback. This goes for all sort of user research, but really make it clear that any feedback that they might give you is useful, both positive and negative, and not to show too much, not to show that that this design is really important and can't be changed. You don't want to introduce that bias that that they would want to sort of be really gentle on you because this is your baby, your project. So yeah, I think getting their feedback initially, and even just as you come up with a design, getting more feedback.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Because when we have involved users in the past, early in the design phase, and with questions like, if there's a reminder, whose voice would you want to hear? And if there's a tone or a sound, what would you want it to be? And what would you like this to look like? And every person has a completely different answer. And so I'm wondering, in your practical experience with this, how do you respond to that? Because you could have it adaptable to each person, but that raises the complexity, or try to come up with some generalized answer based on their responses.
Yeah.
Run into that.
Yeah, I have. So as a researcher, how do you incorporate those differing results? For one, you could ask them, why do you prefer this person's voice over somebody else, and get at the root of their choice, and maybe that generalizes across different people. Yeah, that would be my recommendation there, is just get a sense of the motivation behind that answer. Yeah.
For studies where you use that sort of iterative process, do you prefer to use a complete new batch of participants every time, or let some people see it again so you can get that comparison?
Yeah, it depends on what you're evaluating. Having a new batch of participants will give fresh eyes onto that design, but increases the work of finding them. But if the design is quite different and you don't think that previous experience will influence it, then yeah, go ahead with that. Yeah, like talking about these sort of practical issues and dealing with them.
Yeah, I can see how the iterative process is very, very helpful in development. I also found it interesting that you manage to find things and look at them experimentally, because it seems like there's just so many things that you could investigate, like what you change, what might be important. And I'm just curious if you have ideas about kind of other general principles that you think might be of interest. Maybe you've investigated them, or others have, or are still left to be investigated.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. When we looked at the various different approaches, we had a strategy of being quite cover a wide breadth, and so I think if another way I could have done this PhD research was chosen one and iterate a lot more, which I didn't do. So there's lots of research questions and work that are that are open for each of those different approaches. In terms of suggestions, I think there's pros and cons of each. Yeah, so I think it depends on whether you want to do that more breadth or the depth. For me, I aimed for that breadth one so that I could see commonalities between different approaches. But in the end, the prototype that I had, wasn't as refined, or that we didn't do as much research on them as we could have. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you came up with ways to look at things at the level of breadth.
Mm-hmm.
Found some important things about kind of the semantic relatedness. So I don't think that would be easy to do with all the different things that you could really manipulate. So
Yes.
I thought that was very clever.
Right. Yeah.
Last question for me is, if you don't have control over the design, but you want to help older adults become familiar, have you gotten experience or done research in that, how to bridge that gap without having control over the design?
Yeah. We didn't have any studies specific on that, but I would say that the training, the manual, those are good ways of helping to bridge that gap. I'll touch on this. I'll sort of iterate on this again. That helping older adults to perform those initial steps are really key. And so whatever can be done, either through in person or through some kind of script or something like that, just to help the user to gain some confidence that they are able to use this new technology, that it didn't break on them, that something unexpected happened, is really important.
Yeah, having the scripts to have initial success.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting that you say that older adults need that, because I was talking to Jess, I think it was, who's designing the Android version of the digital memory notebook, and she said she prefers YouTube videos vastly over any kind of other static page of how to do something in app design, because then nothing falls through the cracks of assumptions. You actually see them do that. So it seems to be a pervasive need with older adults.
Right.
That's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, have you seen any data, kind of piggybacking on what she said, I've done a lot of stuff with Adobe Captivate, where you can actually show a demonstration and then ask them to complete the task. And have you seen anything regarding to doing that type of?
Yeah, can you tell me a bit more about that?
So
I haven't
basically
had
what you
experience
can do
with
is
it.
you can show a demonstration of what you want them to
Okay.
perform, and then they go to the next screen and they can actually complete the task you just asked them to do. Kind of like a tutorial, but now we're actually going to move into the step-by-step part, and then they can effectively go outside of that and actually do it. So I didn't know if you'd seen that before.
No, I hadn't seen that before.
Pretty neat.
Yeah. That reminds me a lot of the the help kiosk sort of demo and being able to see that first and being able to perform. So I would expect that would be quite helpful. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
With that kind of, I guess it's sort of a scaffolding approach, like with Help Kiosk, where you have it there for them to help them build confidence and learn how to do it. Do you have a hard time deciding at what point to take it away so that it's not an aversive experience for them when they try to do it on their own?
Yeah. That's a good question. So our thought behind Help Kiosk was that so it's a touch screen, and so obviously not very mobile, and so we were thinking that might be something that would be useful at home, so that you could learn to perform things at home or maybe in a community center at a library, and that you gain some confidence, and when you're out in the field, so to speak, that you would be trying to do things as well. And so we left it up to the user to figure out how much learning they would do. But having said that, we didn't research that further into actually trying that out in the field, and that'd be interesting to see how they do with performing the task that they learned at home with Help Kiosk versus out in the field. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.